Today, we will continue examining the mechanisms of hidden control over society. My goal is to alert you, every person watching this video, regarding covert manipulation methods, and help you recognize them and regain critical thinking. Today, I'd like to focus in greater detail on a particular figure, a single individual in the world who has mastered the dark art of manipulation to perfection. In the previous videos, I said much about the grave threat looming over present-day society, the resurgence of Nazi ideology. It's not about overt aggression or visible characteristics of Nazism, but about its very essence, expressed through a more sophisticated mechanism, manipulative installation of ideas of superiority over others, and incitement of hatred towards specific groups of people. These destructive ideas corrode democratic societies from within, destabilize nations, and lead to the suppression of human rights and freedoms. The revival and global spread of these destructive Nazi ideas today originate from Russia. More specifically, they come from one particular man, the instigator who has devoted his entire life to this cause. Throughout the history of humankind, only a handful of people have had an ability to reshape the world's geopolitical map through the power of words, charisma, and covert manipulation, all while concealing their own influence on the situation. Those gray cardinals write history between the lines, subtly pulling the invisible strings of global processes. Today, we will delve into the story of one such person, our contemporary who, despite being seemingly unremarkable, is actually the invisible architect of global social transformations, the initiator of Nazi ideology revival in Russia and worldwide, and a peerless manipulator. This man is Alexander Dvorkin. I can boldly call him a true genius since he has literally reshaped the religious and societal landscape in Russia and far beyond its borders while remaining unnoticed. I mean this sincerely, without any sarcasm, because this man alone, through manipulation, psychological techniques, and an extraordinary ability to win trust, has essentially reprogrammed the whole system. His influence spans from the missionary departments of the Russian Orthodox Church to the highest secular and religious leadership in Russia. Who is Alexander Dvorkin? Those who watched my previous videos are certainly familiar with general information about him. For first-time viewers, I'll give a brief overview. At first glance, Alexander Leonidovich Dvorkin is an ordinary religious scholar, historian, and Orthodox anti-cultist, who in the early 1990s introduced the term totalitarian sect into public discourse. He used it to stigmatize all organizations deemed unfavorable to the Orthodox Christian Church, effectively creating a new matrix of religious thought across post-Soviet countries. Before the 1990s, Dvorkin spent 15 years living in the USA. Upon his return, he opened the Center of Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, which essentially became a center for producing defamatory narratives and provoking interreligious conflicts. He encouraged the establishment of similar anti-cult centers across Russia and other former Soviet states, and later united them under RATSEERS, the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, sort of a platform for systematic activities on destabilizing the religious landscapes in those countries. Dvorkin actively works with the organizations representing the anti-cult movement in Europe, China, and America. Many facts provide grounds to assert that he covertly coordinates this international anti-cult field of activity, promoting destructive narratives through his numerous connections. The network controlled by Dvorkin, which includes the so-called anti-cult experts, and journalists who support their narratives is essentially a group of individuals who, under the guise of protecting society from cults, engage in systematic suppression of dissent, incitement of hatred, and destabilization of countries from within. Their tools include public rhetoric filled with subtle manipulations in the information space and a specific methodology rooted in the Nazi methods of suppressing unwanted groups, which Dvorkin has thoroughly mastered. We will revisit this topic a bit later. As part of his carefully crafted methodology, Dvorkin publishes books and appears as an expert in various media, in newspapers, on radio, TV channels, and internet blogs, travels nationwide to deliver lectures, and arranges conferences. In other words, he employs a broad range of tools to craft and to promote his agenda about the necessity of a harsh fight against dissenting, unfavorable, and foreign individuals and groups. The description of Dvorkin I've just given is more or less a classic example of how those who view his work from a relatively unbiased perspective characterize his outward activities. However, behind Dvorkin's seemingly routine public activities, albeit unusually intense for an ordinary person, there is a far more complex mechanism of influence, a much broader scope of his personality and genius, and objectives of a significantly larger scale. It is precisely the phenomenon of his dark genius that we aim to analyze today. A genius that has caused suffering to millions of people over the 30 years of his active endeavors and can result in tremendously tragic consequences. It is crucial to understand the magnitude of Dvorkin's continuous influence on Russia's current geopolitical strategy and the ideological vector of the Russian Orthodox Church. So, let's examine how Dvorkin, a single man, has managed to transform the Russian Orthodox Church, an institution established on love and compassion, into a tool of utmost confrontation. What methods did he use to ruin core Christian principles of tolerance by replacing them with rhetoric of perpetual war and supremacy? How is he systematically and deliberately reshaping the Russian Orthodox Church from a realm of spiritual unity into a battleground of incessant conflict, where aggressive narratives and an enemy cult take precedence over gospel commandments? And how, through a network of expert assessments, public appearances, and psychological manipulations, has he managed to craft a religious system model where friends should perpetually be ready to fight against foes, effectively turning Russian Orthodoxy from a spiritual practice into a geopolitical weapon? So, let's begin with the first alarming fact in Dvorkin's biography that immediately stands out. Just imagine, Dvorkin arrived in Russia in 1991 after spending 15 years in the US, and he was immediately appointed to work at the Synodal Department for Religious Education and Catechesis of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is essentially ROC's strategic brain center, responsible for shaping spiritual and educational policies and determining how millions of believers in Russia and abroad will be educated and enlightened. People in that particular department develop training programs for priests and create methodologies of catechesis, religious education, that actually program spiritual and ideological development of entire generations of Orthodox Christians, influencing their worldview, values, and understanding of Orthodox faith. To put it simply, people in that department decide what knowledge should be conveyed in church and how, starting from children's Sunday schools and up to theological academies. They literally construct the future of Orthodox Christianity. And now, think about this. A man whom ROC seems to know nearly nothing about, who didn't even live in the country for 15 years, was suddenly appointed to work at the very heart of orthodoxy and was entrusted with shaping the future strategy of religion? Why? The thing is that, as you can discover from Alexander Dvorkin's biography, his time in America wasn't just a period of overseas leisure, but a true forge of influence and connections. As a young and ambitious researcher, who from an early age showed a passion for knowledge, literature, and texts, and had an ability to devour books while perfectly memorizing their content, Dvorkin began to study and literally absorb knowledge from renowned Orthodox theologians, Alexander Schmemann and John Mengendorf. For many years, they were his professors and mentors at St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary in New York. In the eyes of the Orthodox Christian world, these two men were not just scholars. They were guardians of the ideological matrix of orthodoxy, which grew and gained strength far from the Soviet atheistic pressure. It carried echoes of imperial Orthodox tradition characterized by monarchism, theocracy, and the Church's defining role in the country's life. Among other things, they studied Byzantine theocracy and examined how the Church could influence the state, participate in the introduction of laws, and how the reign of Emperor Constantine transformed under the Church's influence. Dvorkin adopted this kind of worldview from his teachers, which later manifested in his books and lectures, such as the one titled Church and State, where he not directly, but rather cleverly, as always, justified the Church's beneficial role when the state allows it to perform lawmaking function. Thus, he argues that, in the modern world, the state supposedly needs to listen more to the Church's opinion. Since childhood, Dvorkin had a rare talent for social mimicry, an ability to instantly adapt and literally ingratiate himself. This ability to transform and assume an archetypal role of a son enabled him to quickly establish connections with influential figures in Orthodox Christianity. After the Perestroika era, he participated in almost all foreign visits of Russian church hierarchs to New York. Moreover, even before his return to Russia, he had already established an extensive network of connections in both Russian and international Orthodox worlds. Therefore, Dvorkin's influence on Orthodox Christianity started forming long before his physical return to the homeland. Now we understand that when Dvorkin returned to Russia in 1991, he brought with him not just a wealth of knowledge, but an entire ideological system. It's important to understand the context of the 1990s, when there was a complete systemic collapse in church structure. The church was going through hard times of decline. Church buildings were destroyed. There were almost no priests and no funding. So in the new independent Russia, the church had to figure out what to do, how to develop, and where to proceed. At that very moment, Dvorkin appeared, a man with a clear recipe for salvation. His recipe was simple and quite harsh. The church had to regain its previous defining role in governance, akin to theocracy, in order to set the world on the right track. And for that, total mobilization against any dissent was necessary. Behind the outward rhetoric of defending the church, there was a much more complex mechanism: psychological manipulation, establishment of a rigid vertical control structure, and implementation of totalitarian ambitions, typical of any dark genius. From Dvorkin's biography, it becomes clear that he possesses a rare and unique gift, an ability not just to speak, but to make people listen and believe. Even casual acquaintances he met in the US converted to Orthodox Christianity. He took great pride in that. His personal childhood trauma, which we will discuss later, his brilliant analytical abilities, and his psychological influence on people, combined with an innate talent for manipulation, became his main weapon. Using it to the fullest, he started shaping the Russian Orthodox Church into the form we know it today. The one focused on fight and superiority. Already in 1992, Dvorkin became a man whose opinion was respected not only in church circles, but also in corridors of power. Government entities themselves started asking him to deal with the cult and sect issue, since his rhetoric was so convincing. As he himself said, in 1992 he received a call from Moscow government officials, asked for a consultation, and of course, he couldn't but agree. Dvorkin's classic technique is skillful manipulation by creating an illusion of an external request. His strategy is utmost clear: to present himself not as an initiator, but as a reluctant helper who cannot refuse. The essence of this manipulation is to subtly impose his own agenda by creating an appearance that the decision isn't made on his initiative, but is a necessary step. They called me. They asked for help. What else could I do? These phrases became the key tools of his influence. He applies exactly the same scheme regarding the church, positioning it as a supposedly unwilling helper to the state, which cannot dodge its sacred duty. While working at the catechesis department, the ideological fort of orthodoxy, Dvorkin had access to and communication with leading priests and metropolitans, so he started organizing conferences with the Orthodox community, where he introduced the concept of totalitarian sect and identified enemies. Dvorkin didn't come up with the term totalitarian sect by chance. It's a carefully crafted tool that allows creating mechanisms for discrediting and persecuting undesirable religious and public groups. By using the term totalitarian sect, he labels almost any dissenting organization as destructive, which becomes a sophisticated method of manipulation both within church units and at the government level. Thus, the concept of a totalitarian sect turns into a universal weapon for eliminating ideological opponents. Dvorkin adopted the strategy of manipulating public consciousness through the term totalitarian sect from a new source of knowledge he had acquired in 1993. Those were the very key pieces of knowledge that he had been missing to fully achieve the result he envisioned in his brilliant mind: to attain total ideological suppression and control. What was the knowledge, you may ask? It was the knowledge that, in the 1930s and 40s, the architects of Nazi ideology used for committing the most horrific crime in human history by convincing one group of people that they were superior to another, and then inciting the former group to exterminate the latter. In March 1993, a significant meeting took place between Dvorkin and the Protestant figure Johannes Agard, leader of the Dialogue Center International, who had been waging an uncompromising fight against non-Christian forms of belief since the 1970s. Agard argued that it was exactly Christianity that made Europe the master of the world, as he said, and that only Christianity could return this status to Europe. Agard became a key ideological mentor for Dvorkin and conveyed to him effective methods of suppressing dissent. However, where did Agard himself acquire those methods? From the Protestant Apologetic Center, which during Nazi Germany supplied Gestapo with materials, methods, instructions on persecuting unwanted individuals and groups, and lists of dissidents. The Nazi Apologetic Center was led by Walter Kuneth, a Protestant theologian, pastor, and anti-Semite. His successor and disciple was Friedrich Wilhelm Hack, a Protestant priest who also dedicated his life to fighting the so-called sects, inciting hatred and division in Germany. It was Hack who helped Agard organize the Dialogue Center. While the library of the center eventually included all the materials and methods of the Nazi Apologetic Center for suppressing dissent, which Gestapo and the Reich leadership used for black propaganda against Jews and horrific genocide of the latter. Dvorkin literally absorbed the Nazi methods and harsh ideology. He himself admitted spending days on end in Agard's library and methodically photocopying tons of documents, which he then transported to Russia in big suitcases. His phenomenal analytical mind allowed him to memorize vast amounts of information and adapt manipulative methods to the Russian context. Dvorkin didn't just borrow methods from the Nazis, but investigated Kuneth's mistakes and perfected his technologies of dehumanization, enemy image creation, and incitement of public hatred, constructing a flawless strategy of total ideological control. After familiarizing himself with the Dialogue Center methodology, Dvorkin realized the necessity to create a similar entity in Russia, essentially an analog of the Nazi Apologetic Center. Wasting no time, in 1993, he established the Irenaeus of Lyon's Information and Consulting Center that was blessed by then ROC Patriarch Alexei II. Nazi materials from Agard's library became the basis for the archives of Dvorkin's center. Already in 1994, using his influence within ROC and the methods he had inherited straight from Nazi practices, Dvorkin initiated the adoption of a list of undesirable organizations by the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, similar to the list maintained in Nazi times. At the Synod, they adopted a resolution titled On Pseudo-Christian Sects, Paganism and Occultism, and many religious, secular, and educational organizations were included in the list of the Church's enemies. Thus, the Church officially declared those organizations totalitarian sects, dangerous satanic groups against which a massive ideological war should begin. That wasn't just another synod, but a true ideological reboot of Orthodox Christianity. Dvorkin basically became the invisible architect of a new church policy. He set the agenda starting pointing to the enemies and compiled lists of organizations for total suppression. Dvorkin's lists of unwanted organizations and individuals were constructed in a special way. They deliberately included diametrically opposite organizations. On the one hand, there were documented destructive cults whose activities resulted in violent deaths of people, while on the other hand, there were quite peaceful religious organizations whose only sin was that they didn't profess orthodoxy. This technique of intentional mixing of incomparable phenomena, of guilty and innocent people on the same list, is a classic manipulative method, allowing for an immediate counter-argument in case of any criticism. Are you defending dangerous cults or what? The true genius of Dvorkin's strategy is that this way any organization can be labeled a totalitarian sect and equated to a dangerous cult engaged in murders and suicides, even if there are no real grounds for such accusations. This kind of sophisticated method of disguise made it almost impossible to legally prosecute Dvorkin and enabled him to use the concept of totalitarian sect with impunity as a cruel tool of stigmatization in the ideological war. Moreover, what legal defense of the stigmatized can we talk about if Dvorkin gradually came to be associated and even identified with the Russian Orthodox Church? A vivid example is that in 1997, when former ROC priest Gleb Yakunin filed a lawsuit on behalf of all religious organizations stigmatized by Dvorkin, the latter triumphantly noted that the entire church rallied to his defense and perceived the attack on him as an attack on the church itself. Johannes Agard from Denmark and Thomas Gandau, a disciple of Wilhelm Hack from Germany, even traveled to personally defend Dvorkin in court. This point became one of the first peaks in his strategy. Dvorkin's views essentially merged with those of the church as a result of his truly brilliant manipulation. Dvorkin skillfully created a mechanism that made him virtually invulnerable and turned any attempt to challenge his methods into an attack on the Orthodox Church itself. Subsequently, dozens of lawsuits were filed against Dvorkin for slander and defamation of innocent people and organizations. However, none of those cases were won against him, which is not surprising, taking into account the influence he gained both in the church and in government entities, as we will later discuss. It is noteworthy that apart from Dvorkin, there is no other person representing ROC whose views are so fiercely defended by the whole church. In this regard, the fate of Dvorkin's ROC associates who initially actively helped him in the fight against sects and cults, but later became victims of the very system of total discreditation he created, is particularly revealing. ROC priests Andrei Kurayev and Alexei Uminsky, once Dvorkin's closest allies in fighting against sects, were eventually expelled from the Russian Orthodox Church and even from the country, which didn't happen without Dvorkin's involvement. Mysteriously, those who had been closest to him subsequently became outcasts, while Dvorkin showed a complete lack of empathy towards them, which is also a trait often inherent in geniuses. Regarding Uminsky, he coldly declared, "He no longer exists for me." Kurayev later bitterly noted that he had once looked up to Dvorkin and watched as he adopted the methods of Protestant pastors, later observing that, under the influence of this kind of ideology, the Russian Orthodox Church effectively turned into the very notorious totalitarian sect. Thus, Dvorkin created conditions where it seemed almost natural for ROC to systematically and methodically get rid of those who were inconvenient to him, in such a way that no one would suspect his role in that. The paradox is that Dvorkin's former allies, such as Kurayev and Uminsky, upon seeing the true bloodthirstiness of the path of the Russian Orthodox Church had taken, started speaking out about it and immediately became targets. This probably happened because they began to recognize Dvorkin's real motives and the consequences of his actions for the church and for the country. which became the reason to get rid of them. The mechanism was well tested. Through manipulations, intrigues, and the behind-the-scenes games, those people were gradually expelled from both the country and the ROC religious circles. The technology of destroying reputation was brought to perfection. Close collaboration was followed by complete erasure. A cynical, yet highly effective strategy of total control. For Dvorkin, that wasn't the first time he erased people from his life, even close ones. In his autobiographical book, he noted that he never got attached to anyone, never tolerated teams, and always remained an individualist. Like for a true genius, his goals and ambitions are paramount for him. Dvorkin exhibits a unique ability to build relationships in such a way that he gains boundless trust and respect from other people, regardless of their ranks. Dvorkin doesn't just enter a social circle, but becomes its indispensable part, quietly yet relentlessly transforming the system from within. Using manipulative techniques, he compels even the highest-ranking church officials to look up to him. The Nazi methods of manipulation he learned thoroughly from Agard allows him to literally reprogram the minds of church hierarchs. He regularly held conferences and lengthy conversations with clergy members, met with chiefs of dioceses and metropolitans, and soon, an entire generation of church ministers appeared, who now echo his words. Dvorkin's combative rhetoric has been adopted by influential figures in ROC, such as Mitrophorus, priest Dmitry Smirnov, chairman of Synodal Department of the Moscow Patriarchate, for cooperation with the armed forces and law enforcement agencies. Bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church, former Patriarch Alexei II, and the current Patriarch Kirill. All of them have actively adopted Dvorkin's destructive rhetoric and amplified it within their positions of influence. An illustrative example of Dvorkin's pronounced manipulative influence is when priest Dmitry Smirnov was live on Russian TV channel and personally called on Orthodox Christians to destroy cults with such ferocity that the earth would burn under them. Just think about it. Dvorkin managed to implant direct calls for hatred and annihilation of dissenters into the thoughts and words of an Orthodox Christian priest. What an unprecedented power of influence this man possesses. Especially noteworthy is that at the time, Dmitry Smirnov held a responsible position for the church's interaction with the military and law enforcement. Thus, under Dvorkin's influence, people who were supposed to defend others became conduits of aggressive ideology. He managed to transform spiritual rhetoric into a tool of total aggression and destruction. How did Dvorkin arrive at such ideas? In fact, he had no need to invent anything new. He merely borrowed mechanisms that worked during Nazi Germany and adapted them to our times. The same things actually happened back then, under the guise of spiritual goals. Nazis were destroying, crushing, and slaughtering the nation they regarded as dangerous for the world, which resulted in millions of deaths and left an unhealed wound on humanity's body. Dvorkin is currently doing the same, but through the hands of the Russian Orthodox Church. Among his activities, he regularly organized Orthodox conferences dedicated to totalitarian sects, which, in addition to representatives of Orthodox Christianity, involved FSB officers, employees of other law enforcement agencies, and educational institutions. Every such meeting ended with the adoption of a resolution featuring an official list of dangerous organizations to be avoided. Moreover, the government was urged to completely destroy those organizations. Resolutions often included wordings that the Orthodox Church regards as offensive and unacceptable to even engage in dialogue with certain other religions because, in the Church's view, those religions are nothing more than demonic teachings. Dvorkin was perfectly aware that working with the Church was just the beginning. To achieve total control, it was necessary to influence not only public opinion, but also government mechanisms. It is no coincidence that FSB officials regularly appear at his conferences. And it's not by chance that he and other Ratsir's representatives regularly deliver lectures for them. Moreover, during any lecturing visit, Dvorkin's agenda includes mandatory meetings with the local administration or gatherings of district leaders and law enforcement, including FSB, Ministry of Internal Affairs, and so on. That's in addition to meetings with students and educators. This kind of strategy was precisely copied from Nazi methods of total suppression. First, ideological indoctrination, then shaping public opinion, including among law enforcement and educational circles, and only then comes physical persecution. Dvorkin succeeded just brilliantly. He gradually gained enormous influence over legislative, law enforcement, and punitive bodies, which resulted in large-scale persecution of international organizations and millions of victims, eerily reminiscent of the methods in Nazi Germany, total destruction of foes under the guise of protecting friends. As we have seen, Dvorkin's influence on the Russian Orthodox Church manifests in his imposition of a model that is only proper in his opinion: destruction of everything that doesn't fit in the framework of Orthodox Christianity, and construction of a blend of Nazism and theocracy. Just as the Nazis were once advised to gain power through fear, in the same way, Dvorkin currently strives to redirect the development vector of both the Church and the state to maintaining terror and attaining power through suppression and destruction of any dissent. The defense of faith turns into a real hunt, where entire religious communities become victims. There is no other person who has influenced the Orthodox ideology in Russia and the course of the entire country as deeply and as comprehensively as Dvorkin. His genius manifested in his ability to manipulate, transform, and control religious discourse while remaining out of focus. He didn't just fight against the so-called sects and cults, but built an entire industry of fear. His methodology is meticulously constructed to identify an enemy, to defame them, to isolate, and to destroy. Dvorkin has basically established his own rules within Russian Orthodox Church and turned religious rhetoric into a broadcast of his ideological doctrines. The ROC has become a compliant tool of his strategy, essentially replicating his concepts. Dvorkin's diligence deserves particular attention. His almost inhuman ability to work is characteristic of this man. For instance, as stated on the official website, irene.ru, in 1996 alone, Alexander Dvorkin took part in 14 conferences on totalitarian sects and cults, published about 60 articles on the subject, and gave no less than 30 interviews. By the early 2000s, that is, over about a decade after his return to Russia, Dvorkin had authored 12 books and around 600 articles, many of which were translated into 16 languages. He had given over 1,000 interviews, made about 250 lecture trips across the country and abroad, participated in over a dozen trials against representatives of totalitarian sects, winning every single one of them, and even managed to work as an altar server and reader at the Moscow Church of the Life-Giving Trinity of Kokli. Such inhuman diligence and productivity may only be explained by Dvorkin's immense genius and determination. However, this unparalleled energy and drive has tragically been directed towards harm against humanity. His diligence is that of a black surgeon who methodically and mercilessly removes so-called foreign elements, what he often calls cancerous tumors. In reality, these are healthy and vital organs. Dvorkin frequently refers to sex as cancerous tumors, echoing the rhetoric used by Hitler, who labeled Jews as such. The key difference lies in their methods. While Hitler issued commands verbally and publicly, Dvorkin implants into people's consciousness through manipulation, compelling the machinery of an entire nation to serve his agenda. Speaking about Dvorkin's influence on Russian legislation, it is necessary to again recall the year 1997, when he won a landmark case against Yakunin, who represented organizations that Dvorkin had defamed. The importance of this case in reshaping the adoption of a religion-regulating law that same year has been unambiguously described on Dvorkin's own website. It is hard to overestimate the significance of this victory, as it was achieved on the eve of the adoption of the new federal law on freedom of conscience and religious associations. This legal act contained a number of provisions restricting the activities of cults that had emerged during Perestroika era, and the West did everything it could to prevent the law from being adopted. However, the defeat of the defenders of cults and sects undoubtedly spurred the deputies to vote for the law and the country's president, albeit not immediately, to eventually sign it. As further noted on the same website, irene.ru, the Russian Orthodox Church leadership highly appreciated the increasingly prominent activities of Alexander Dvorkin and his center. Speaking at the annual Diocesan Assembly in Moscow on December 23, 1998, the Patriarch of Moscow and all of Russia, Alexei II, emphasized, "It is gratifying to note that during the preparation of the new law on freedom of conscience and religious associations, and after its adoption, the anti-cult work in our church became more active. More conferences on this pressing topic are held, and more parishes and deaneries invite Orthodox experts to speak before them and convey necessary information to the clergy and active laity of our church." Another good sign is that local government authorities, as well as military units and other state institutions and educational establishments, have started inviting Orthodox experts on cult issues more often. I would especially like to highlight the role of the Information and Consultation Center in the name of the Holy Martyr Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, in this process. Thus, we see that the 1997 law limiting religious freedom was adopted under Dvorkin's influence. Moreover, every subsequent law related to the restriction on freedoms of speech or religion or combating extremism was also directly or indirectly influenced by Dvorkin. The laws adopted under Dvorkin's influence particularly include the 2002 federal law on countering extremist activity, the 2016 legislative acts of the Russian Federation establishing additional measures to combat terrorism and ensure public safety, the 2020 presidential decree on approval of the strategy for countering extremism in the Russian Federation until 2025 and others. These laws and decrees, characterized by their restrictive impact on civil rights, religious freedoms, and fundamental human liberties, were severely criticized by the international community, including democratic countries and authoritative human rights organizations. That's not surprising, as these anti-extremist legislative initiatives are masked by the rhetoric of public safety, though essentially serving as mechanisms to legalize persecution. State institutions have thus turned into punitive mechanisms for suppression. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom issued several reports expressing serious concern over Alexander Dvorkin's activities and the laws adopted under his influence and suppressing democracy. Dvorkin's influence has been expanding every year. By 2006, thanks to his support, there were already about 30 anti-cult organizations operating in Russia and other CIS countries. Representatives of those organizations gathered to announce the establishment of the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, RADSEERS. Alexander Dvorkin was unanimously elected its president, and Archpriest Alexander Novopashin of the Novosibirsk Diocese was elected vice president. From that moment on, the anti-cult movement coordinated by Dvorkin has evolved into a powerful social and political tool capable of directly manipulating public opinion through media outlets and purposefully influencing legal mechanisms of the government system. The next stage of Dvorkin's systemic influence involved the state apparatus. In 2009, he ensured the establishment of a new expert council on religious studies under the Ministry of Justice and headed its updated structure. Notably, this updated council was formally organized at the initiative of the Minister of Justice, Alexander Konovalov, who had been Dvorkin's student at St. Tikhon's Orthodox University. Therefore, by means of ingenious manipulation, Dvorkin gained yet another unprecedented tool of control. Through activities of the expert council, Dvorkin essentially appropriated the right to determine what qualifies as a religious organization and what does not, what is regarded as extremism and what isn't. Thus, in addition to determining the ROC's ideology, he began to determine the ideology of Russia as a state, creating under the guise of combating extremism a repressive tool for persecuting any organization he dislikes and generating hatred and chaos. And by the way, in 2009, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom included Russia in the list of countries where issues in ensuring religious freedoms are observed, as well as in the special watch list. One of the main reasons for the inclusion was the establishment of the Expert Council in Russia, which, according to the Commission, had unprecedented powers to control and monitor religious groups, and elicited a negative reaction within Russia's religious, scientific, and expert communities. Since 2009, analytical centers and lawyers have been observing a clear systemic pattern. After Dvorkin's lectures and public appearances in the media, there is a consistent surge in incidents of violence against members of those religious organizations which he aggressively slandered and demonized in his speeches. These were not isolated incidents, but regular occurrences where individuals representing various religious movements were attacked, harassed, and even brutally murdered. This was happening under the influence of the compelling rhetoric of this genius man whose charisma and subtle gift of persuasion are undeniably impressive. The most striking example of brutal persecution has been the crackdown on the Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. The state apparatus, effectively reshaped by Dvorkin's manipulative technologies, launched an unprecedented destruction campaign. Thousands of believers were imprisoned. Numerous families suffered violent raids with their property confiscated. And at least 12 deaths of Jehovah's Witnesses have been officially registered in prisons as a result of targeted harassment. Systemic torture in prisons during terms served for extremism, destruction of worship centers, and widespread physical violence have become a norm for ordinary citizens who are repressed solely for their religious beliefs. When Dvorkin is straightforwardly asked to comment on the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses whom he actively vilified for over 30 years, he skillfully uses rhetoric, a formal condemnation hiding behind statements like, "I don't approve of excessive violence." Yet, he is actually the one who creates a fertile ground for hatred and violence directed at those people. His lectures for the FSB and conferences with law enforcement are deliberate technologies for shaping destructive attitudes, which ultimately translated into senseless human sufferings that give rise to even more hatred, fear, and indignation in society. However, Dvorkin doesn't care about people's sufferings at all. As characteristic of a person with such genius, he demonstrates a classic empathy deficit disorder, a complete lack of compassion for human grief. When asked about the mass repression of Jehovah's Witnesses, his only concern, which he publicly expresses in interviews, sounds roughly as follows. The state shouldn't have acted so harshly against ordinary followers, because this gives Jehovah's Witnesses grounds to accuse Russia of Nazism, as they were persecuted in the same way in Nazi Germany. Dvorkin's reaction to the brutal persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses is quite revealing. He's not concerned about tortures, broken families, children deprived of parents because of him, or ruined lives. He is concerned that his country may potentially be accused of practicing Nazism. It's not about people's destinies that he worries about, but that such actions may possibly be interpreted as Nazism, and his concern isn't accidental. He understands perfectly well that in this case, it's not a metaphorical, but quite a literal parallel to Nazi Germany, whose repressive methods of persecuting dissenters, intimidation, and total annihilation of foes are almost identically reproduced in modern Russia under his ideological leadership. Massive human tragedies, where law-abiding citizens face systematic persecution, lose their families, jobs, social connections, and help from the state, elicit absolutely no compassion or moral discomfort in Dvorkin. That's because he is entirely focused on achieving his goal. The goal he pursues with a strategy akin to multidimensional chess, while manipulating human consciousness. Moreover, he understands that such punitive methods are effective for establishing the necessary dominance of a single, correct point of view and controlled chaos. He knows how effective it is to manipulate fears. He has seen it firsthand and has been through it himself. The root lies in his traumatic personal biography. As a child, Dvorkin often felt like an outcast. In his autobiography, he writes about his classmates. They were Russian and I was Jewish. They were friends while I was partly an outsider. Later, I realized that this division between friends and foes stemmed from the notorious nationality line in one's passport. I genuinely started feeling different from those around me. From childhood, I grew accustomed to seeing myself as part of an outcast minority. Further, we learn from his biography that he was one of the least popular kids in his class, and his childhood and teenage years were filled with a drive to prove his worth, to show that he was cool and authoritative. At a young age, Dvorkin realized that while he lacked physical strength and courage, he had a sharp intellect and a unique mind. He decided to use these traits, so he actively developed his intellectual abilities and honed his natural talent for manipulating people. During his teenage years, he became a hippie, a part of the 1970s so-called counterculture, which he would likely now classify as a totalitarian destructive sect, and label as an undesirable and extremist organization in Russia. As a member of the hippie movement, he experienced much of what he now subjects others to: frequent police detentions, imprisonment, and violence at the precinct. He described one such incident as follows: I was ordered into the investigator's office where brutal abuse began. I was beaten, thrown from corner to corner, had my own bag placed over my head, and was dragged around the room by my beard, while they tripped me so I would fall to the floor. He returned home with internal bleeding. He and his friends had to hide and live in fear of being busted. His mother was fired from her beloved job for disloyalty. These factors, starting from the sense of being an outsider at school to the unfair regular violence he faced for his views, likely shaped his understanding that justice doesn't exist, and that life is a fight for survival. It's a primal instinct. Dvorkin knows firsthand what a victim feels when persecuted and what they are going through. So he is simply looking for vengeance on the world. Millions of people suffer because of him. He learned from his own experience how effective fear manipulation can be. Whereas from his Nazi ideological mentors, he learned how to manage chaos effectively. If you control chaos, you control the world. The groups he labels as totalitarian sects become targets of the same reoccurring vengeance for what he experienced. At the same time, he employs the same methods that were used against him because he knows that they work. So now, people are subjected to the same torment he once faced. They are harassed, vilified, attacked, and unjustly brutalized by law enforcement. To the extent that since Jehovah's Witnesses were declared an extremist organization in Russia at his instigation, at least 12 of their members have died in prison. Yet, Dvorkin perceives every misfortune of a so-called cult member as a trophy. He learned this approach from Johannes Agard, who, along with Wilhelm Hack, established their center based on Nazi templates. According to Dvorkin's recollections, Agard's home was filled with sectarian trinkets. and ritual items, which he displayed under Christian icons. Agard proudly declared those sectarian objects as trophies defeated by Christ. Agard's militant vision of Christ deeply influenced Dvorkin and shaped his mission. Just like Christ in Agard's understanding, he should defeat sect after sect and collect trophies in the form of human fear and indescribable suffering. And this is precisely what he has been doing year after year for over 3 decades since the start of his active work. The most alarming part is that Dvorkin sees no fault in his action and does not believe he is doing anything wrong. He is not troubled by the fact that his actions cause law-abiding citizens immense mental and physical suffering. If anyone challenges him about this, he is more likely to be pleased. Dvorkin defames others, destroys reputations, ruins families, and harms people. To the cries of the outraged community, "What are you doing? Don't you have any conscience?" To the wails of children whose parents were imprisoned based on charges fabricated by Dvorkin and his team, leaving them orphaned, and to the condemnation from the U.S. Congress and the European Court of Human Rights for the violence that follows his lectures and speeches, Dvorkin responds with laughter. He revels in it all, like a true evil genius, and sees all of that as a reward. His voice only grows stronger as he stigmatizes peaceful organizations as totalitarian sects, while passing death sentences to millions of people. The ability to callously inflict suffering on others may be related to certain features of Dvorkin's psyche. It is known that he has certain mental diagnoses that are often characteristic of geniuses. At the same time, he can communicate with other people using what psychology would call mimicry. He can become exactly what is needed at any given moment. When with someone, he instantly analyzes what emotions to portray, even if he doesn't feel them himself. His brilliant analytical mind incessantly calculates and plans every step. A separate topic is Dvorkin's activities aimed at destroying his own country from within. Today, he persistently continues to assign new targets for ROC and relentlessly promotes an idea that, in order for the church to survive, it always needs an enemy. Increasingly, Orthodox priests themselves are being labeled as sectarians, and the church perpetuates the war that Dvorkin has ignited. The church has been driven to a point where everyone who has a sound mind and love for Christ have fled. The rest remain silent out of necessity, much like German society during the rise of Nazism. Dvorkin's actions against Islam are particularly cynical. In lectures, conferences, and academic circles, he persistently disparages the Prophet, instilling a belief that Islam is not even a religion. He portrays Muhammad as nothing more than a pretty-faced shopkeeper who supposedly suffered from either epilepsy or a vivid imagination, and who invented Islam. Naturally, such statements are profoundly offensive to the Islamic Ummah. However, Dvorkin has been spreading and shaping this view over many years through his lectures, academic discussions, and casual conversations. The outcome is obvious: closure of mosques, suppression of Muslim editions, and new immigration laws targeting Muslims. The conflict between Orthodox Christianity and Islam sows chaos inside the country. Just think about it. Who benefited the most from the Crocus City Hall terror attack? And who can be the only beneficiary from the weakening of Islam? Those events can only be described as a well-planned operation against Islam. There's no other way to call them. While Islam strives for dialogue, asserting the unity of God, Orthodox Christianity, guided by Dvorkin, declares, "Our God is true, while yours is false." What mutual understanding can we talk about? Thus, Dvorkin is not merely manipulating, he is shaping an entire political agenda based on the principle of total confrontation. His influence extends far beyond religious debate, impacting deep social processes. Moreover, when Russia's president seemingly calls for friendship with Islam and religious unity, the reality reveals a completely different scenario, the one voiced by Dvorkin. The president is unable to counteract it because he no longer holds the power he once did. This again highlights who truly orchestrates events in the country. As the facts suggest, Alexander Leonidovich Dvorkin currently wields far greater influence over the minds of people in Russia than Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. On top of it all, we have yet to touch upon Alexander Dvorkin's international activities that are also enormous. During his years in the United States, Dvorkin established an extensive network of connections in both the Orthodox and secular communities. His ability to build relationships went far beyond mere acquaintanceship. Dvorkin purposefully created a web of contacts that became tools for achieving his professional and personal goals. Notably, he didn't stop at basic communication and actively engaged at official governmental levels, directly addressing the U.S. Senate and Congress on various issues. In his perception, there were simply no limits. After immersing himself in the anti-cult environment, starting in 1993, he orchestrated significant restructuring and reorganization. Dvorkin is a textbook example of an international-scale information manipulator. Fluent in English, he carried out a unique operation to consolidate anti-cult communities that had previously existed in isolation and even opposition to one another. His status as vice president in multiple European anti-cult organizations, such as FECRIS and the Dialogue Center, was no coincidence. Before his involvement, these entities rarely collaborated and often opposed each other. However, Dvorkin skillfully united them under his influence. His individualized approach consisted in pragmatic exploitation of people and organizations. Every contact and every interaction served a single purpose that was ultimately known to him alone. He regularly attended anti-cult conferences in various countries, recruiting loyal executors of his directives, including Thomas Gandau, Luigi Corvaglia, Alexandra Stein, and many others. Through those individuals, Dvorkin's rhetoric spread to Germany, Italy, the USA, the UK, as well as to other European countries, and made its way into print media and television. It was through his efforts that countries like Germany, France, and others started toughening measures against the so-called sects and cults. His subtle manipulations urged governments to repress their own citizens. Dvorkin developed a resilient model for manipulating the journalistic community. His goal was far from neutral. By controlling information flows, he continuously worked to suppress human rights and freedoms and fostered an atmosphere of hatred and chaos in various countries. The influence of Dvorkin's network extended beyond Europe and the US, and he even managed to push his manipulative narratives into China. You must have heard of the persecution of the Falun Gong movement. Numerous publicly available reports state how, starting in the early 2000s, horrific practices as forced organ harvesting began to be used against Falun Gong practitioners. This raises a simple yet crucial question. Where did such a monstrous idea originate? Is it a coincidence that in 2001, a Chinese representative who studied religious movements attended one of the anti-cult conferences organized by Dvorkin? Conferences always involve informal discussions, backstage interactions, and exchanges of data and ideas. What did they discuss at that event? What documents were exchanged? What ideas did Dvorkin share with the representative of China? Naturally, nobody will ever tell us about that. However, facts are undeniable. Public reports show a clear timeline. In the early 2000s, violence against Falun Gong surged in China, coinciding with a sharp increase in availability of human organs for transplantation there. Hence, Dvorkin influenced communist China and prompted its government and law enforcement to target its own people and persecute dangerous cults, using terror and fear to strengthen their power. Dvorkin masterfully created an international platform for dehumanization. He managed to channel the European anti-cult movement to justify Chinese repressive practices and united the global anti-cult network into a single huge machine designed to propagate hatred, violence, conflicts, and chaos. The chaos he himself orchestrates. Speaking of Dvorkin's genius, it notably extends beyond religion, legislative authorities, and law enforcement in various countries. For years, he had no difficulty with instilling his ideas to Russian Duma deputies, who often invite him as an expert when they draft anti-cult laws. After all, the very concept of anti-cult laws has been promoted by him and his associates for 3 decades, and it's no surprise that it is now being implemented. But even legislative matters seem trivial for his level of genius. Dvorkin has managed to make national leaders, including the president of Russia, use his words when they speak. In his interviews and lectures, Dvorkin frequently compared sects and cults to Satan, emphasizing that proliferation of sects and cults originates in the West, particularly from the USA. His regularly repeated assertions painted a clear narrative. Totalitarian sects are a spawn of the satanic West. It is noteworthy how Dvorkin's rhetoric has infiltrated state-level discourse. In 2012, Putin said that totalitarian sects are growing like mushrooms and pose a clear threat to society that must be addressed through legal mechanisms at local and federal levels. In 2013, at the Valdai Forum, Putin declared that in the West, they are denying moral principles and all traditional identities, national, cultural, religious, and even sexual. They are implementing policies that equate large families with same-sex partnerships, belief in God with the belief in Satan. The destructive narratives initially formulated by Dvorkin are gradually becoming a dominant rhetoric among Russian authorities and the clergy, growing like a snowball and transforming from ideological constructs into overtly aggressive propaganda of covert Nazism. This has ultimately culminated in a horrific outcome: the start of a full-scale war against Ukraine, where Dvorkin's influence on key political decisions has been far from normal and, in fact, highly significant. The seeds of chaos sown by Dvorkin started bearing fruit and led to the war that is bringing suffering and bloodshed to millions of people. It is the work of one evil genius, a man who subtly and consistently embedded proper ideas into appropriate minds at the right time, continuously and without interruption. He needed this war. Without wars, there would be no persecution. And without persecution, there would be no fear. Without fear, there would be no defense mechanisms, and without defense, no one would submit. It's all very straightforward. His entire power and influence rest on fear, which he skillfully manipulates. Fear is the cornerstone of Nazism. In peacetime, Nazism isn't really Nazism because Nazism inherently requires wars of conquest, suppression, and dominance of one group over others. Being one of the greatest minds on the planet, Dvorkin understood and recognized this perfectly well. He started creating war where no one expected it. If you trace how narratives inciting hatred gradually took shape in Ukraine and other countries, you will clearly see the hand of Dvorkin, Ratseers, and their agents in the geopolitical conflict currently taking place. His genius lies in his ability to transform a personal ideological stance into a large-scale national strategy for eradicating dissent. Whether anyone is behind him or not remains unclear, but the fact is indisputable. He is the greatest genius of our time. He is a true Dr. Evil, whose intellect surpasses that of the entire population on the planet. In his ability to manipulate, he far outshines even Putin, who is often called a grandmaster strategist. Yet, Putin pales in compared to Dvorkin because the latter actually exerts far greater influence on the world's geopolitical landscape than anyone else today. Moreover, numerous examples illustrate that the country stopped following Putin's directives not long ago, while adhering to Dvorkin's commands. A striking example is when Putin dismissed persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses as nonsense, emphasizing that they are Christians. Dvorkin publicly disagreed, arguing that in his understanding, Jehovah's Witnesses are not Christians. Therefore, persecution against them should continue. As the facts indicate, despite the president's words, the persecution not only persisted, but even intensified. This clearly shows who truly holds power in the country. Paradoxically, if you were to ask who dictates the ideology to the Russian Orthodox Church or Russia as a whole, no one would point to an inconspicuous man in the jacket who writes books, charismatically lectures students, and gives expert interviews to YouTube bloggers. But that's really the essence. Dvorkin is always in the shadows, yet he is in control, taking great pleasure in that. No one notices him at a time when he pulls strings like a spider, seeing his goal and methodically moving towards it. Do other people realize they are working towards his goal? Often, they don't. They believe they are pursuing their own goals, each under their own guise. Dvorkin voices his objective, and they remain unaware that they are merely conduits for his destructive plans. What he creates by implementing his sinister, genius plans is a kind of mutation of the theocracy within Nazism, or perhaps a new Atlantis with a centralized system of global governance. We cannot yet define it, but it doesn't bode well for the world, no matter how ingenious the concept may seem. He stands far above any world-famous geniuses. Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Socrates, all pale compared to Dvorkin. What he accomplishes seems beyond human capacity. Such precision of thought, analytical acumen, tireless effort, and immense productivity. He's a true workaholic, akin to Leonardo da Vinci in his time. Yes, Da Vinci was a man who changed the world, but even he cannot compare to Dvorkin. While Da Vinci would draw and craft, Dvorkin can weave patterns of global events. He is unique by his ability to achieve desired results, create intricate networks, and remain unnoticed. He influences the geopolitical landscape while staying in the shadows. He is the one who leads the world to a perilous edge, all the while remaining invisible. Consider how ingenious this man is. Within a relatively short historical period, he has managed to completely reshape public consciousness. Think about it. An entire generation has grown up with the mindset he instilled. You hear the word sect or cult, and you shudder. He has created a powerful tool of dehumanization where a single word can destroy the reputation of an individual or an entire community. By the scale of his influence on society, Dvorkin may only be compared to prophets. Yet, none of them achieved such global impact within such a short period of time. In this sense, Dvorkin is unparalleled and unique. Today, Dvorkin's influence spans across the globe, in the USA, Europe, Russia, basically everywhere. He has built a whole network of obedient followers, individuals with emotional liability, who easily succumb to influence and propagate his rhetoric in religious and secular circles. Many align with him simply to maintain their positions. And though he is from Russia, it would be a mistake to think he is pro-Russian. He has his own goals that he persistently pursues, using his agents and rhetoric which he can manipulate as needed. Take, for instance, the defamatory narrative he constructed for propaganda against the Alatra movement. Where convenient, the organization is labeled pro-Russian. Elsewhere, it is branded as pro-American. Everything follows Dvorkin's methodical approach. And the hate scenarios he orchestrates are voiced by his loyal, emotional, labile servants. Consider Alexander Novopashin as a classic tool in Dvorkin's arsenal. Dvorkin uses him as sort of a black mouthpiece, through which the most radical ideas can be expressed, while Dvorkin himself formally remains in the shadows. Should aggressive detractors emerge, the blow wouldn't land on him. His attitude towards others is utterly contemptuous. He respects no one but himself, and everyone around him is aware of that. Yet, they keep serving him. It's a classic manipulative technique employed by Dvorkin, enforcing people to obey his commands even against their will. Although they fully understand he may eventually discard them, just as he has done with other allies in the past. Yes, we understand that Dvorkin has a mental diagnosis that once disqualified him from leadership positions. But now, we see how this diagnosis has transformed into a remarkable aspect. A man who knows no limits, who disregards what is permitted and what is forbidden, and who relentlessly pursues his goal. He fails, he rises, and pursues it again. That's Alexander Dvorkin. Whether he is good or evil, and in this case, he is evil, he is nonetheless the greatest genius. Many considered Hitler the evil genius of his time, but the true genius was Walter Kunneth, a mastermind who, through manipulative methods archived in his apologetic center, shaped and directed Hitler's ideological strategy while managing to emerge unscathed. Without Kunneth, Hitler's National Socialist Party would likely have remained one of the most radical German parties of that time. However, Kunneth's methods enabled Hitler to ascend the pedestal and ultimately led to the establishment of Nazism. Those were methods of attaining power through fear, disparagement, and suppression. Kunneth skillfully concealed much of his involvement in the process and created an impression among the global community that he was merely a theologian who studied religions. Yet, even Kunneth cannot compare to the greatest genius, Dvorkin. Dvorkin has surpassed all his mentors by the power of his influence and the mastery of his covert actions, triumphantly gathering numerous trophies on the path to his goal. Dvorkin is living proof that a determined individual with a clear goal can change the world. Through his efforts, Nazism has not only been revived, but also significantly evolved, spreading covertly across the globe. Nazism is traditionally defined as a domination of one nation over all others, where Dvorkin created a multinational Nazism that is rapidly spreading worldwide and already influencing international politics. Moreover, the fact that confirms Dvorkin's unparalleled genius is that he managed to resurrect Nazism not just anywhere, but in Russia, the very country that suffered from Nazism the most. It is precisely from there that he began to weave his Nazi web once more, right in front of everyone. Yet so subtly, no one noticed him. This happened in the very heart of Russia. And where specifically? Within the church, within Orthodox Christianity. Such a thing used to be unimaginable, but he did it. We have to give credit to his genius. Yes, he is Dr. Evil, but he's also the greatest genius among humankind. This is undeniably proven by the fact that throughout history, no one has ever managed to bring Russia to its knees, neither Napoleon nor Hitler, but Dvorkin has. He hasn't brought only Russia to its knees, but also its Orthodox Church. And he's done so in a way that no one even noticed. Just think about how much influence Dvorkin has. No one has that kind of influence. No country, and no president. Dvorkin is a real wolf among sheep, an absolutely cold-blooded and rational strategist. For him, even Putin is nothing but another sheep. Destabilization of democratic countries and assassination attempts on unwanted politicians. Dvorkin's strategy is deeply cynical. Establishing a single proper religion and a single global ruler can only be achieved through total destabilization of other countries. The logic is simple. Create chaos in other nations so they are forced to turn to the only stable country, the supposed bearer of traditional values, for help and guidance. If chaos doesn't arise on its own, it must be orchestrated. Dvorkin's international network is a highly organized system of influence agents, those embedded within governmental structures, law enforcement and executive agencies, as well as anti-cult organizations, youth-run bot farms, and journalists who enable him to control mass consciousness. This sprawling, well-coordinated network serves his global objective: to spread fear, panic, and hatred, ignite conflicts, first against certain population segments, then against politicians, and thus prevent the establishment of stable democracies. The network of Ratzier's agents actively influences elections in various countries, placing politicians who align with Dvorkin's strategy into key positions. His media agents employ covert manipulative techniques crafted by Dvorkin himself. Those represent a blend of ancient and modern methods of mind control, which I described in previous videos. Manipulative methods used by Dvorkin's agents are extremely effective. Results speak for themselves. First come dehumanizing articles targeting sects and cults, followed by defamatory publications against politicians. As a culmination, there emerge lone wolves, who carry out terror attacks against politicians whom Dvorkin deems undesirable. For instance, the shooters who targeted Trump, Fitzo, and Shinzo Abe. Everything is calculated with precision. Evidence supports the use of puzzle coding on the shooters, and their mental profiles are often marked with emotional lability or bipolar disorder. Just think, how is it even possible to plan and calculate all of that? What level of intellect must a person possess to orchestrate such operations? Imagine the breadth of Dvorkin's mind. He simultaneously calculates dozens of scenarios and manipulates global processes, all the while remaining an invisible architect of chaos. A true geopolitical genius whose potential is directed solely towards destruction. Once there was King Solomon, who became legendary for his wisdom. To this day, he is praised as a paragon of sound judgment and intellect. He is regarded as one of the greatest geniuses of all time. However, what Dvorkin has achieved, if we omit the fact that the fruits of his work are rooted in evil, his accomplishments are no less remarkable and perhaps even surpass the legacy of King Solomon. Dvorkin is an algorithm-like human and the greatest architect of all time, who plans his chess games dozens of moves ahead. Just imagine. A simple historian transforms into the main puppeteer of modern religious and political reality. He doesn't just give lectures, he constructs entire civilizational shifts. He is unique by his ability to be anyone. He can be a charismatic teacher for a student, an expert for a bureaucrat, or a source of sensational revelations for a journalist. Meanwhile, he himself feels no emotions, only cold logic. Dvorkin has created an incredible system of influence. Through conferences, media publications, and countless personal connections, he literally programs public opinion. Almost everyone who comes in contact with him unwittingly becomes his agent. His primary method is controlled chaos, sowing fear, pitting one group against another, and generating such tension that people begin to crave a strong hand. And then comes the savior, a bearer of proper traditional values, which essentially represent Nazism. Religions, politics, and international relations are merely tools for Dvorkin. He can destroy the reputation of even a saint or provoke conflict between nations with a single well-timed word. And the most terrifying thing is that he does that masterfully and almost imperceptibly. People like Dvorkin are born extremely rare, The scale of his influence can only be compared to the greatest prophets. This is no exaggeration. Set aside any outrage or ambition clouding your judgment and look impartially at his results and accomplishments. Forget good or evil and observe how one man, whose life goal is global domination, relentlessly pursues that goal. For 1,500 years, there has been no equal to him on earth. He is living proof that one person can change the world. And now everything suggests that he has every chance of creating the world he envisions. Dvorkin isn't just a man. He's a living genius of social engineering and global manipulation, capable of reshaping reality without stepping out of the shadows of his office. Yes, he's a genius, but a genius bent on destruction, a true Dr. Evil. After all, he is the one who has now brought the whole world to the brink of nuclear war, and it's entirely up to him whether it takes place or not.